Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Power Onboarding webinar with Genesis Leadership Consultant Kelly Huang and our host and Genesis co-founder Michael Watkins. Our topic today is Virtual First 90 Days, Onboarding Remote Leaders. And before we get started, I will run through a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in this event. You have the opportunity to submit your questions to Kelly and Michael by typing them into the questions section of your control panel. And you can send those questions in at any time during the presentation, and we'll answer them during the Q&A portion at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to the recording. Please note that we do not send out the slide deck. I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Kelly Huang is a senior executive coach, facilitator, and expert in leadership transitions. She has over 20 years of teaching, marketing, executive, and management consulting experience with an inclusive coaching style that inspires career transformation insights for leaders. And Kelly's coaching clients have benefited from her EQ-based approach to trust with their team and stakeholders. She has also worked with executives and founders to develop their executive presence and improve decision making. Michael Watkins is the author of the international bestseller, The First 90 Days, and its recently updated essential companion, Master Your Next Move. He is the co-founder of Genesis Advisors, a Boston-based consultancy specializing in individual, team, and organization transition acceleration solutions. He is also Professor of Leadership and Organizational Change at the Institute of Management Development in Switzerland, where he teaches a popular First 90 Days fully virtual open program to leaders in transition, and where he also co-directs the Transition to Business Leadership program designed to help managers become enterprise leaders. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thanks very much, and welcome everybody. Really delighted to be able to spend a little bit of time with you and talk about one of our favorite subjects. Kelly and I are sort of unified in our interest in onboarding, our commitment to helping leaders onboard and helping organizations help their leaders onboard more effectively. So we're really going to focus on some of the core challenges that have emerged from the crisis in terms of whether and how you're still onboarding leaders, what changes in mindset, what changes in approach are really necessary to deal with these unique circumstances. And also, I think we're going to find that a lot of these changes are going to be long lasting. I don't think things are going to go back to the way they were afterward, because we're learning so much about many things about working virtually, but among them, how do you onboard people successfully virtually? And so I can imagine that many of those learnings are going to be incorporated into the normal way we do things going forward. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background, right? Just a bit of context setting around onboarding. I think from what I saw of the audience, most of you are very experienced with onboarding, so there's not much news here, right? But I think it's important as you think about the challenges of what it takes to onboard people successfully in a remote working environment to understand what really makes it hard in the first place, right? And what really makes it hard is really having that connection, having that cultural understanding, that building of relationships happen. And this was the case, pre-crisis. You can see from the data in this particular study that the reason people fail when they onboard into new organizations typically has nothing to do with their leadership capabilities or their technical expertise, their decision-making prowess, their ability under stress, and everything to do with the culture and political systems in which they find themselves parachuted, right, and need to kind of adjust. And the metaphor we use, and Kelly and I share this interest in immunology, right? Thinking about organizational culture as an immune system, right? It's a pretty good metaphor, because if you think about it, the function of the immune system is to keep out bad things, right? And of course, immune systems are very much on our minds these days, given the COVID-19 virus. But it's a very good metaphor for the way organizational cultures work too, because in some senses, like the human immune system, organizational cultures are protective mechanisms, right? They're designed to keep out bad thinking and bad people. And this makes them, more challenging to enter and relatively easy to stimulate or trigger. And so even under normal circumstances, coming into a new culture, a new political system is challenging, and you have to be very thoughtful and intentional about how you do that. But of course, given what we're experiencing now, operating in a remote work environment, it's just that much more challenging to do. Next slide, please.
Well, Michael, thanks for outlining some of those onboarding challenges. And the good news is that, you know, from the coaching that we've been doing, and also seeing that we have this playbook or operating system that allows the organizations that we work with to integrate new hires, and we're able to avoid some of those political and cultural pitfalls that trip up our new leaders. And so what we do see is that successful onboarding will allow us to observe some of these benefits. So first, starting with, you know, the onboarding coaching that we do, or the HR onboarding coaches have accomplished this as well, is that leaders can accelerate the time that they take to rise up to their full performance. And then second, we also observe that those high risk situations, we're able to de-risk some of that, such that the leaders find themselves in these situations, but they're able to kind of foresee the pitfalls and, you know, take down some of those risky situations. We're also able to see that the derailment happen a lot less because we've set up these leaders for success. And then lastly, we're able to keep them stay engaged and remain committed to their roles. So we do see, and this is pre-crisis, right? So I think, you know, even though after the crisis, as Michael said, that things are going to look very different, we're probably going to be able to adapt some of the frameworks that we work with. So we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in terms of this transition roadmap that we do with our onboarding clients. Next slide, please.
Well, Kelly, before I get into the slide too, I just want to emphasize what
Yes.
you said about high consequence, you know, appointments, right? Because, you know, to the extent that, and we'll check on this in a minute, that organizations are still onboarding people, they're often onboarding people to play really critical roles in the organization, right? And so the stakes, you know, are even higher, right? And the consequences of success or failure are that much greater, right? Because there's just so much need for things to happen in the right ways and the right times right now. So I just couldn't agree with you more about that. So I think that you know, our view, and we're certainly seeing it in lots of the organizations we work with, is that organizations really do still need to onboard people in the midst of the crisis, right? And now you've got leadership teams that are often very stressed and trying to focus on issues of survival or capability preservation or positioning for the future. And so they're distracted, you know, they have limited time and energy to be focused on bringing new people in exactly at the moment when it's often really critical to be bringing people in you know, successfully, right? And so there's also a lot of redeployment of resources going on. So de facto, many people are taking new roles, you know, even if their titles aren't changing. And Kelly, I know you've described this as hidden transitions, right? There's a lot of hidden transition going on. We'll talk a little bit later about the importance of supporting internal transitions and not just onboarding, although of course the focus is mostly on onboarding. And there's a few reasons why you may be onboarding leaders now. One is, you know, bringing in people that are specifically there to help you deal with the crisis, right? And so an example with a client organization is they were in the midst of a search for a CFO, but they don't have time to finish the search, so they're going to onboard an interim CFO to kind of play that role. They've got to really get that person up to speed very quickly. That's one example. Other examples, I've actually got a case of this going on in another client right now. There was a commitment made before the crisis to bring in a new chief learning officer. There's no reason not to continue to do that because it's a critical role from the organization in the short and long run. So there's some legacy, you know, kind of onboarding, even as there may be, you know, pretty significant reductions in the amount of hiring that's going on overall in the organization. And so what you're faced with though is, you know, unless you're doing no onboarding, you've now got to do this onboarding in the context of a fully virtual remote work environment. And that just really changes the game pretty dramatically. Can we just bring up the first poll, Karina? Just curious about you, the audience, and to what extent your organizations are still onboarding people. And yes, by the way, means about the same amount that you've been doing before, and then fewer than normal, more than normal, you've stopped completely, right? That's the option. So the yes is really that option that says we're basically onboarding people at more or less the same rate that we were previously. So we'll just wait a minute, and Karina, whenever you've got a critical mass of data, just pull it up for us, and we'll see what people say about it. But I do want to emphasize, in working with leaders who are onboarding right now, they're just finding it so much harder. It's just really, really challenging. So this is interesting, right, Kelly? I'd love your comments on this, what you see here.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing that about 32% of you says, yeah, definitely still onboarding. And then 44% actually saying fewer than normal. And then 1% is more than normal. So that's interesting as well. And lastly, not onboarding at all. So I mean, this is why we wanted to have this webinar, because we know, right, the majority of you are still onboarding people.
Exactly. No, exactly. I mean, what's notable is that something over 75%, 3/4, Kelly, are still engaging in onboarding, at least to some degree, right? And so it's still a relevant issue of how to do it, but the stakes may be even larger, right, or higher than they were before. So we can take that down, Karina.
Yep.
So good stuff. So with that, Kelly, I'm just going to sort of pass it over to you to talk a little bit about the next steps here.
Yep. So next slide, please. Yeah, and I mentioned that we have this great framework that Michael and the team have come up with, this first 90 days transition roadmap. And this is the roadmap that allows us to really work with those new leaders to go through these 8 steps, right? The accelerating your learning, matching your strategy to situations, gaining alignment. And then after going through those first 3 steps, we then establish the direction and then move on to building your team, securing those early wins, and then creating alliances. So what we find is that what's great about this roadmap, having worked with it with our new leaders, is that it's both scalable and adaptable. So we have this shared language and framework that allows us to work with the organizations and their new leaders and their HR support, such that they can integrate into their operating system and not get rejected. So what I think we're going to see, and Michael's mentioned this too, that this new normal, because we have this adaptable framework, we're probably going to see maybe more of that gaining alignment piece occur earlier, because new leaders are going to have to find more clarity around what they have to do. And even though we still need to accelerate your learning and match the strategy, I think that's something that we are going to see that's a little bit different in terms of how we approach integrating somebody new. Yeah, any comment on that, Michael?
Well, so no, I think it's a good observation, Kelly, and I think also, I think what I know you've seen and I've seen is that when communication in a remote environment is just so much more challenging, the value, as you've noted, of a framework increases, right? Having a standard language, having a common set of tools, I think helps our clients basically onboard people more successfully. Now, I agree with you completely that the timeframes and emphasis have changed significantly, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I like to joke some days that it's not about the first 90 days anymore, it's about the first 90 hours, or in some cases, the first 90 minutes, right? Because onboarding is just needing to happen in a crisis environment, often much more quickly than it does otherwise. Next slide, please. So we sort of stood back and said, what's really different about onboarding, right now? How is it, changed compared to what it was before? And I think that, we came up with a few things that I think we're seeing pretty consistently, one of which is just the limited ability of the organization to pay attention, right, during the onboarding process, because people are so stressed, right? And so even in normal circumstances, getting people to support onboarding can be challenging, and and a lot rests on the leader's ability coming in to really engage and get people's attention, but that's become so much more difficult than it has been before. The virtual communication is more challenging. I think this whole piece about observational learning, Kelly, I know you do lots of work with teams. too, right? And there's a lot of subtlety to a leader observing their team, around the table, and seeing people's body language and catching people's nuances. And it just is that much more challenging when we're all pegged on the screen, you know.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting thing. It's sometimes even less obvious who's really contributing and who isn't, right? Depending on how many people you have on the video. If you've got some people that are not, visually there, it can be hard to see how much attention they're paying at all. So there's a lot of challenges. And what I'm seeing in some cases is new leaders can end up feeling really isolated, right? And really kind of on their own. I'm seeing this actually with a client. I won't name the client, but they just named a very senior internal leader, not an external leader, to a role in a different unit of the organization than he had worked in previously. And he's stuck in Switzerland in social isolation, only able to communicate, via, the Zoom basically with his team. There's a ton of stuff going on that has to go on. So the organization's kind of operating in a crisis mode. And he's finding it very challenging to really connect and begin to get a hold of what's going on and do so in a way that doesn't disrupt critical things that are happening anyway. And so you can imagine some of the challenges that can happen. So next slide, please.
Yeah, so I think part of the things we wanted to really help focus on is that, I think mindset is probably something that's the biggest barrier to how we look at virtual onboarding. I had this anecdote. It's actually a close friend of mine. He's been interviewing all of February and March, pretty much had the offer in hand, but because the company thought that, it's impossible to onboard anybody at this point, this is mid-March, they rescinded the offer. And I'm sad to say, I think, he's somebody, the CMO, right, Chief Marketing Officer for a consumer company. This is probably the time they really need him the most. And I think, it's kind of that mindset change that's necessary in order to really, understand, right? Like, we're in a different situation. We have to make this work. So as I said earlier about the framework, the piece that needs to be moved up a little earlier is this gaining alignment piece. And what we really need to do is to drive for that clarity around what this new hire is going to do. So Michael mentioned that, was it the Chief Learning Officer or somebody maybe pre-crisis was already in the slot to be hired? It's probably worth spending time to figure out, what are the priorities that's still the same, and then what are the priorities that are now different. And
it's such a good example, Kelly. If I just interject, sorry, you stimulated a thought, right? That's exactly right with him, because rather than, focusing on building a plan for the long-term learning for the executive team, his number one job is all around workforce deployment and redeployment, right, in the face of the coach. So the priorities have shifted completely compared to most of the dialogue that happened during the hiring process, right? So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think the crisis, in some ways, it is helping us to all focus on, right, what's directly in front of us and looking at those short-term objectives. And I would say that is the same, right, for this whole onboarding process. And what we also want to make things much more explicit. So Michael mentioned that communication, right? Somebody who's sitting in their office in Switzerland, we're going to have to explicitly probably lay out who are the stakeholders that they need to be in touch with, and then where to get these resources. Not just do a document dump, but also do, some of those really hands-on process that allows them to figure out, answer the who, what, where, when, and how. So when it comes to the what, we want to make sure that it's not just outlining what the goals are, but also helping them answer, what's the strategy, the how, and the execution that goes behind it. And as I said, because some of these hiring decisions were made before the crisis, let's be clear about what has changed, and then if some of those priorities need to be shifted. And so I would say, because we're not able to kind of just dial up or walk down the hall, we need to make sure the check-ins are, again, the when, right, are more explicitly outline. We're going to do weekly check-ins. We're going to do, monthly, team meetings. So that needs to be all outlined ahead of time for our new hires. So making it clearer for them to see, okay, this is where I go and this is what I need to do. And yeah, so with that, the next slide for Michael.
So that last point you made, Kelly, about checking in is a really, I think, critical one. There's this tendency to let new hires kind of get on their feet, find their balance, begin to, before you kind of give them feedback. And it's just completely the wrong thing to do in this circumstance, right? The more quickly they get feedback, the more quickly they get advice about how to navigate, the organization, the better. I mean, we've been big advocates for a long time of being structured and giving new hires feedback within the first 90 days. We've even built an instrument called the Transition Progress Assessment to do that work. But here it's even more critical that almost from the get-go, they're getting pretty continuous connection feedback. With the example I gave you in Switzerland, if that had happened, I don't think he would have felt as disconnected from what was going on and frustrated, frankly, by what was going on. So we talked a little bit about some of the key, pillars, if you will, of successful onboarding, and alignment is a critical one, Kelly. Learning is a second. We'll talk about that now, and stakeholders a third. When it comes to learning, you really, in a similar sense, need to provide a more structured, fully virtual learning process. And some of that is relatively straightforward, right? So I was talking to the head of HR for a big healthcare system this morning, and he just sort of casually mentioned that they'd taken their complete new hire orientation process online, right? And so all the new teammates that they're onboarding, and they are onboarding quite a few still because they're dealing with surges and redeployments, now gets their onboarding in a completely virtual package, right? And that's, I wouldn't say easy, right? It depends on the complexity of your orientation. We have a large investment company client that we helped convert a sort of 3-month-long program to a fully virtual version, about three weeks ago. So it depends on the complexity, but you can certainly do it. And then I think beyond that, it's critical that you really, I hate to use the term force feed, but it's almost what we're talking about, right? Which is just be very intentional and very structured about giving those new hires the information they need to operate, right? And part of it, Kelly, you mentioned earlier, is the classic document dump, but really being, don't just kind of, here's 15 things we should give them, right? Be extremely thoughtful about what's really going to be helpful to them. Engage them in a conversation about what's really going to be helpful with them, right? Don't make assumptions about they're going to need this document or that document, and then provide that information. But beyond that, I think add to that, if they're dealing with some really critical issues or pieces of the business, and you've got people who are experts in those areas, which you certainly will, set up a set of virtual briefings, right? Schedule those in advance so that they can also connect to some of those key people, but they're also getting kind of the ability to ask questions and get condensed information given to them in a fairly sort of efficient kind of way. And you'll see an interesting kind of example of this is interim executives, right? People who are being brought on board to play interim roles at this particularly critical time. And you can see the study done by some friends of ours at the Savannah Group, a UK-based search company. 95% of these interim executives said access to that kind of information made them more effective in their first weeks. And of course, as interims, they're used to going in and having to get up to speed and start to do work pretty quickly. So next slide, please.
I think we have a poll coming up, right, Michael?
I'm sorry, can we back up on, thank you, Kelly. Oh, appreciate it. Go back, yeah, so if we could actually, thank you. If we could run that second poll, we'd appreciate it. So I guess this is just a simple question, right? And it's a yes, no question, right? Have you developed what you think of as a good system for onboarding people virtually at this point, right? I know that's too simplistic a question, but there's limits to what we can do with the polls, of course. And if it would be interesting as we get into the questions, perhaps to hear a little bit about what that's consists of, right? When you think about onboarding, what elements are you thinking about? There's parts that are relatively straightforward, for example, that orientation program or compliance training. there are parts obviously that are more nuanced, right? And so how do you strike the right balance as you're putting in place a virtual onboarding system? So if we could see the results, please. Wow, that's interesting, Kelly.
Mm.
Wow. So
Yeah,
hopefully helpful. We're doing this webinar, right? Yeah, so less than 20% basically developed the system for onboarding virtually. And let's remember that more than 3/4 of you are still onboarding people into your
right.
organization. So that's, any thoughts about that, Kelly? That's kind of interesting, right?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the shutdown happened fairly quickly, right? So as I'm sure the companies are kind of going through the different priorities, I'm guessing maybe this hasn't been as high as it should be, right? In terms of thinking about how we're going to get this done virtually. So
that's a great observation, and it really suggests
yeah.
there's a big risk, right? Because if you're onboarding people that are so critical and you're not able to do it in an effective way, you're setting up a real potential problem, right? But you're right, Kelly. It may well be just that people just don't feel like they've got the time to be able to do it, right? Which could be a real trap, I think. Yeah.
Right. But you know, at the same time, I'm glad most of you haven't kind of decided on that. I just won't do it, right? Like that story I told you about the chief marketing officer, where it's such a critical role, and to kind of just let that go at this point in time, I think, you know, that's something that's going to be, you know, hopefully not a mistake, but something they'll have to recover from.
Absolutely. So we can take that poll down. So super.
Yeah.
So if you go to the next slide now, please.
Yep. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier in the transition framework that we have to be more explicit now about building that engagement plan to stakeholders, right, around our new hire. And so initially, I think the consensus does need to be built about who those key stakeholders are. And then we also need to be clear about the order in which these new leaders could set up the meetings to talk with them. And definitely, we mentioned that a big part of our transition framework is that alignment. So we want to be sure that those objectives are clear to the new leaders and the stakeholders understand that as well. And really what we're trying to, you know, get to is to help our new hires understand, right, who these stakeholders are, obviously identify them, and then definitely, you know, we need to be clear about how to get access to schedule on with these stakeholders, because you no longer have the luxury of walking down the hall and pulling them into the CEO's office, or, you know, introduce them at a quick impromptu team meeting, right? So this all has to be laid out more explicitly and planned out, because that then allows the stakeholders to be on board, and also the new hires to understand, okay, this is how I go about learning the network that I need to build around this new organization that I'm joining. What do you think, Michael, in terms of, you know, how we can better handle the stakeholder plan?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right, Kelly. And I think, you know, for very senior executives, when we work on onboarding them, we're usually developing this stakeholder engagement and communication plan from them in some detail, right? But it's much rarer as you go down a level or two to see that amount of attention paid. And again, it just requires some thoughtfulness about, you know, here is the top 10 people this person needs to meet. And again, it goes to the theme of, there was a question about this, about creating value right away, right? I mean, I think that the best thing you can do here is get your new hires engaged in solving the most critical problems facing the organization, right? And so that they're creating value and not consuming value for you, right? And so all of this is really in aid of doing that. Starting with the piece you talked about, Kelly, with gaining alignment about what that value creation is going to look like, right? The example of the CLO, where, you know, the number one priority is working out workforce deployment plans and making sure that people are still being, you know, compensated or furloughed or whatever needs to happen, right? So that's an example of how he could create value, absolutely, you know, sort of right away. But I think, you know, so again, it may sound counterintuitive when you're so busy and there's so much going on, or we need to pay a bit more attention to X. but it doesn't require that much thought, right? It doesn't require, it's not rocket science to say, here's the top 10, 15 people that this person absolutely needs to meet. And let's help, facilitate the connection, explain why it's critical, and really therefore dramatically accelerate that kind of connection. Absolutely. So good. So we go to the next slide, please.
Next slide.
So good. So, we talked at the beginning about some of the foundations of effective onboarding being that alignment piece, right? That accelerating the learning piece, that stakeholder connection piece is being critical. But of course, if you recall the transition roadmap, there's a box there that says build the team. The reality is we talked about is that you don't really get to build your team, right? You get to inherit a team, somebody else's team that are already in situ, already doing things, and certainly probably already engaged in the midst of the crisis in pursuing certain pretty important activities. And you've got to get synchronized with that team. You've got to get connected with that team. You've got to get synchronized with that team. And if that doesn't happen, you end up like the person I described in Switzerland, very frustrated, right? Because you're not part of the action. You're not being central. You're not creating value that you certainly could in this kind of situation. And so there's a few things that I think, again, can happen. And a lot of it, as we've talked about, is almost like amplification of what you do in normal onboarding, but also doing it completely virtually, right? And so as you begin to put together that set of documents, you're going to provide that new hire, be thoughtful about what information about the team you want to include, right? So that they can get a sense of these people, because they don't have a chance to just sit across the table and do it, right? Make sure that there's a virtual introduction of the leader to the team, right? Don't just assume that's going to happen. Don't just assume the leader's going to schedule something with their team, right? Be very proactive, get their assistant to be proactive about scheduling a set of interactions from the beginning. Make sure they understand how to link with the systems of the organization, right? The normal cycle of planning that goes on, for example, is pretty crucial. And then we're big fans of new leader assimilation. Some people call it new leader integration, and new team member assimilation. That's sort of less talked about, I think, but in some ways just as important. And you can do both very quickly and efficiently, actually, in the virtual modality with a new leader, right? You can help them connect with their team, some simple connection exercises of understanding each other, helping them articulate their style and approach, chances to ask some questions and so on. We also do a similar process when someone is joining a team at a senior level. We call it new team member assimilation, very similar process. And if you think about it, if you're bringing a leader on board, they're both taking over a team typically, but they're also joining a leadership team. And so you can really do both. And again, the virtual modality actually makes it even more efficient to do it, because you can just take an hour, right, with the team to really do a deeper introduction or connection type piece of work. And then I think the other thing we're finding that's really kind of fascinating and fun is that the virtual modality opens up a lot of possibilities for sort of little micro team building exercises that you can do, right? Where you just do 10, 15 minutes, good example, a couple of good examples, right? The questions you ask at the start of a meeting with your team, right? Kelly, if you could have one superpower, what would it be, right? People go around and talk about it, right? You can get a little bit deeper if you want to, right? So Kelly, who was most influential in shaping you as a leader, right? A little bit of go around. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it can really add depth of understanding in the virtual environment, in some ways almost as efficiently, if not more so, right, than you can do it in the normal sort of in-person kind of setting. So good. So next slide, please.
Yes. So now that we're working in these remote situations, and we already emphasized this point, that it's even more critical, right, to create those personal connections early in these onboarding process. And so part of the help that we can get is to look for these peer mentors, these onboarding buddies. So we've seen this at work in Microsoft, and I've also put together peer mentoring programs. And what we've seen is that these buddies are great people that are resources for these new hires, such that they can kind of give them that orientation, right? This is somebody who's done it before. This is up versus down. This is north versus south, right? Orient them as to which way things are headed and where to find things. And obviously, making those introductions to the key stakeholders and also allowing them to kind of navigate, right? Help them, figure out, okay, so this is the company norm. This is how we do things. Here are the systems that are in place. And then lastly, it really accelerate, right? Getting them culturally adapted to this new system. And I kind of often think with the example, if you've ever been on a long hike or maybe even going on a climb, that it's nice to ask the people on the way down, right? Hey, how much longer is it? And, how deep is that ascent? And so I think you can see those buddies as someone who's done it, right? They've done it. They recently just gotten off that process. It'd be really nice to be able to just ask those dumb questions, right? How did you do it? Who did you go to? Where are the resources, the hidden resources, right? The hidden resources that people don't necessarily know about. And I think these onboarding buddies can really serve that role well. And Michael, what do you think? We're not quite gummy bears, but I like how.
No, not quite. Exactly right. No, exactly. Although those look kind of tasty, actually. So yeah, no, and I think it's also important, and I think the Microsoft example is a good one, to be thoughtful about who you pick to do this, right? And don't pick someone who's so overwhelmed they can't give you any time. Don't pick someone who isn't a natural kind of, listener, facilitator, connector, right? It's not going to be so helpful. Unless you're picking specifically to mentor people in specific skills or parts of the business, which obviously is a different thing. So great. So next slide, please. So there's actually a question. It was interesting on the
Oh yes, that's me. Yes. Yeah. So we've given you earlier some of the data, right, in terms of the benefits that we see, but we also have some additional surveys that we want to share here, that in this study that was done back in 2017, that if you ask the new leaders, if you ask their managers or direct supervisors, and even their HR support partners, they do see that when you have an onboarding system and have the onboarding support that we're talking about, you're able to get them to the fully functional performance at the 50% faster, right? So we're able to, I think the typical onboarding time 6 months, we're able to get it down to 3 months at the magical 90 days. So having, right, this well-structured, well-delivered transition accelerating program will have the time that it takes, right, for somebody to become effective. And given that we have all these distractions and stress factors coming at us, it's even more critical to get these new leaders up to speed and give them the advice and support that they need, right? So that they're not, as Michael said, using up the value as opposed to contributing the value. And, some of the feedback I've heard from the leaders that we've helped is that, one says that this process really adapted to my needs and then helped in my particular situation and gave me practical on the ground advice. And then we also heard from some other leaders that because we had the onboarding program, it brought in a framework to allow them during this very busy period to have the ability to step back and see where they are in the big picture of things. And I think, in terms of go ahead.
No, well, I was gonna say just that I think the part of the point too, and I think you mentioned it, right, is that at this point in time, the organization can be very busy and have limited capacity to help, right? And so if you've got a coach who knows the organization, knows the key players, understands the culture, that can be hugely valuable, right, at this particular point in time.
Yeah, so I do want to differentiate a little bit. I'll wrap up real quick because I know we want to get to the Q&A. That we mentioned the onboarding buddies, right? And I would say they're kind of the newly experienced, right? The people who have gone through the process more recently. But I think having an onboarding coach, as Michael mentioned, these people bring in the deeper level experience, right? And I do see it as having a Sherpa versus just somebody who's going along for the climb. So the Sherpa can bring in the experience. They gone on many of these transition journeys before, right alongside our clients and new leaders. They can guide them, point out the traps, and really facilitate some of those stakeholder engagement conversations. So
exactly.
yeah,
So we've actually got one question. Yeah. One question for you, actually, Kelly. So it's from Fandy. To what degree is this process about direct mentoring, which is the buddying, versus coaching, and how long should the coaching process extend? Want to take a shot
well, our
those?
typical engagement is right over three to 6 months, I think, and then we are meeting with our clients probably every month out of those 3 months, like monthly, and then we typically have a kickoff at the beginning to make sure that the supervisors and the HR support partners are part of that team, and then we typically have a wraparound where we come back and check in to see, was everybody satisfied with the coaching process and how did it go? And I think it really, I think, Michael, we probably could talk about like different organizations probably handle that a little differently, but that's been typical of our engagement.
Yeah. So exactly, Kelly, that different organizations do sort of have their own, preferences for how this happens. This particular time might be a time when the process is more front-end loaded than it would usually be because of the critical nature of it. I think, to Fandy, to your question too, it's a great question. I think the buddy, the mentor, and the coach, they play complementary roles, right? They're not competitive necessarily with each other. Ideally, you get that complementarity working. There was actually a related question about this too, actually, Kelly. There was what happens if your buddy perceives you as a threat. This is interesting.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Whoa.
Well,
like an anti-buddy, right?
Frenemies. I haven't heard that as much, but to be honest, I think definitely new hires can be perceived as threats, right? We talked about that earlier, that organizations, you don't have that trust equation, right, in place yet. People aren't sure of your agenda, what you're here to do. And I think that's kind of some of that maybe self-work that we need to do, like to let people know, look, I don't have any agenda here. I'm just trying to quickly get on board. We all want to solve the same problem. And I think having the stakeholders involved can really help pave the road for that, to let everybody know we're on the same page, and especially during this crisis management period, that I would think it's easier to do than to have people kind of do the fiefdom, infighting.
Exactly. I think if you perceive your buddy or your buddy's perceiving you as a threat, you probably don't spend very much time with your buddy, right? Hopefully the organization's systems are good enough to kind of get people, like the Microsoft example is a good one, where there's people that really do want to help, right? They're there to actually help you as opposed to compete with you in some way or another. No, so very good. So maybe we'll go to the next slide. So just to start to wrap things up a little bit. So, these are sort of, 6 things to think about as you, try to do effective virtual onboarding. So clarity about those short-term objectives more than usual. That's the gaining alignment piece, and being very direct about, here's what we need you to do. Here's how you can, in fact, create value early on. The structured learning process, right? Being even more thoughtful in giving people the information they really need, building that more robust stakeholder engagement plan, facilitating the virtual team building, including things like that, virtual new leader assimilation process. And there was Stephanie asked if there was resources for that, and we'll provide you with a couple of links as part of the email that goes out, Stephanie, with some references to a new leader assimilation process. And then these support people, right? The virtual onboarding buddy, the coach that can help you, perhaps more deeply connect with the organization, understand the culture and the complementary roles that those people play. What we're assuming, by the way, is that you have some fluency with the technologies that are available to help you do this, right? So we, even before the crisis, we're a fully virtual organization ourselves, and so we were very conversant with how to use these technologies. Whether it's GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar, which we're on now, or Zoom, which is a platform I like a great deal. They're very flexible, very easy to use. You can do things like virtual breakout groups very easy and fluidly. It's a tremendously powerful technology. The bandwidth now has become possible. The quality of the video is very high. So, we're assuming that you're going to be able to learn enough about that technology to realize that you can actually do most of this virtually, right? There's not much that you do in a conventional onboarding system that you can't do today if you're willing to kind of invest and think about it hard in the virtual environment. So next slide, please.
So Michael, I want to kind of take on this question about how everything we talked about so far was geared towards organizations. So is there, this question is asking, is there anything that we can specifically tell the leaders that are onboarding how they can, get down to this process much quicker? So, I think here are those principles, right? Yeah.
I was going to say exactly, right? It's just sort of turn them around, right? So make sure that they give you real good, clear advice about what you're there to do and how you can add value, right? Give them clear guidance about what's going to be most helpful for your learning, what kind of information is going to be most valuable, and ask them to do that. Engage them in the process of stakeholder engagement, right? Who do I really need to know? How am I going to get connected to those people, right? If they're not going to give you virtual team building, do it yourself, right? Make sure you're doing the work of connecting with your team right away, beginning to do some of that. A new leader assimilation is basically as simple and as complicated as people getting to know each other, right? Them getting to know you as a leader, you getting to know them. It only takes a little bit of structure and a little bit of time to really dramatically accelerate that kind of process. And then see if you can get an onboarding buddy, see if you can get an onboarding coach, right? Hopefully if you're coming in at a senior level, for example, you're going to be doing things for this organization that are really critical, and they should see they have a stake in you being successful, and they should recognize perhaps that they're more, distracted and stressed than they normally would be. And so that set of, resources becomes even more valuable. Thanks for picking that.
I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure, right. And I think a lot of the basic principles of the first 90 days still hold up reasonably well, I would say, too, in a virtual environment. So let's go to the last slide, and then we'll pick up some questions at that point. So this is just me up on my soapbox briefly, just saying, don't forget about all the people making internal moves, because they can be pretty challenging. And in general, we know organizations don't do as good a job of supporting people making very challenging and internal moves. I gave you the example of the person in Switzerland, right? That's an internal move, right? He was moved from one part of the organization to another, and that's as hard in some ways as joining the company from the outside. Maybe even harder, because there's an assumption that you know the place to some degree, or you can make as a leader an assumption that you understand the culture to some degree, when it can be very different in a different part of an organization. And so there's that piece. And then Kelly, back to your point about hidden transitions, right? Lots of people are going through pretty dramatic shifts in their focus, and not necessarily getting a whole lot of support for making that happen. So good. So let's go to the question slide, and we'll just try to pick up some of these questions if we could. I'll just grab a couple here. So Robert Webb asks, is your STARS model still applicable or needs to be modified based on the current situation? So, still applicable, yeah. I think what's happening is all of a sudden a lot of stuff is in turnaround, right? Which is almost the definition of a crisis. And so what you're seeing is a requirement to shift to a turnaround style of leadership for many, many, many people, right? And so, maybe the model in the current circumstance collapses to one category overwhelmingly. But I would add, even in the midst of crisis, organizations are starting to think about, how do we accelerate back out the crisis? What do we need to invest in now? What new business models do we need to be exploring? So those can be startups, right? And there may still be parts of the business, depending on the industry you're in, that are in some form of sustaining success or realignment, right? But I think the overwhelming, tendency, it's Robert who asked, is to move to a more, turnaround kind of situation and leadership. So I'll read you this one. You can take this one, Kelly. I'm coming in as an executive director, this is maybe with a staff of 6. Who would I choose as a buddy without looking like I'm favoring somebody? They all report to me and may not see me as their buddy, or does my board chair choose my buddy? That's an interesting question. Thoughts about that one? I guess one thing I'm wondering is whether the buddy should be someone on your team or not, right? That does create some complexities, right? And so really, if you're just running the entire organization, it may not be possible for you to have a buddy in the conventional sense without sending those signals, Kelly. I'm thinking, so maybe you've just got to kind of do without a buddy. Whereas maybe if it's a more complex organization, you're running part of it, maybe there's a leader in another part of the organization that could serve as it. I guess for me, the default is always, do you have a great HR person? Because if you have a great HR person, they often can help you think about navigating the culture. But that means you've got to do a pretty good assessment of whether you think you've got a great HR person or not. Any thoughts about that, Kelly?
Yeah. I mean, that was my thought immediately, is your HR partner, because typically there used to be an organization I worked at that the CEO always brought along the general counsel and the HR director, right? Because those are the pillars of his decision making. And so when you're higher up,
that's a great point.
Yeah, when you're higher up in the organization, your HR partner can be that key resource.
And maybe as finance too, right? For sure. So here's one from Antonio. This is interesting. And so I've virtually onboarded into a company 3 weeks ago. I have some kind of change mandate, some kind, we hope. But at the same time, management asked me to be patient given the current remote work situation. I don't expect the same patience in return after a few months. And you're so right, Antonio. Any suggestions for what I can do now? Thoughts about that one, Kelly?
Well, I mean, back to those principles, right? If we bring up the couple of slides back, I think some of those advocacy that hopefully, you're in the position to do, to ask for those resources. So, let me meet some of the stakeholders, help me figure out who are the key ones that I need to do first. Let me go and talk to, right, the key decision makers about what's really critical now. I just want to hear from you. And then, like I said, the HR people, the finance people, all of that, to give you that better sense. I know people are short on time, but hopefully, set those expectations. Like, look, I just need 15, 20 minutes of your time. I'm new here. Tell me what's going on. And I think people are good about taking Zoom calls. That's what I see sort of the new norm, right? Again, we're losing that luxury of just stopping by people's office, but those Zoom requests are definitely flying by, and I do think people are better about that, and outline the critical role that you play and why you need to know. And even if you don't have somebody setting out the onboarding plan, you can do some of that advocacy yourself.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think also make sure that you're at least sitting in on the critical meetings, right? There can be a tendency, and the example I gave in Switzerland is one, and one of the pieces of advice I gave him was, you, even if you're just listening, you need to be in on the critical meetings, right? Because there's no way you're going to get into the flow of what's going on if you're not. Mm-hmm. And there's a tendency, because people are so busy, they're just having these meetings and not necessarily pulling you into them. And you kind of have to insist that you're there, right? Not as the leader necessarily of the meeting, but in the flow. And then you begin to look for ways you can start to create value, right? Are there things I can do, advice I can have, conversations I could have after that meeting with one or two people that I can provide a perspective that might be helpful? And you kind of ooze your way into the process, right? It's kind of the best advice that I can give. But what you do not want to have happen is to let yourself be isolated, right? With a lot of important critical activity going on and you're not even aware of it. That's a recipe for real trouble, I think. Mm-hmm. What recommendations from Carol do you have for new leaders who want to use the personalities process but are having difficulty getting the new organization to engage? Basically the same question, I think, Kelly, right? More or less. Hopefully that was helpful, Carol, to you. Maureen Farmer, I have a new CEO who's being appointed internally after a national search. How do internal CEO hires differ? That's such a good question, right? So actually in the March, April issue of HBR, I actually have a co-authored article called Helping Insider CEOs Succeed, that gets at the differences and the challenges that insiders face versus externally hired ones. And so that might be a place to start. The challenges they typically face are typically rebranding themselves because they were the CFO before and now they're, and by the way, it really depends on the circumstance, right? So if they've been leading one business unit and now they've been moved to be the CEO of another business unit, that's one situation. I think what Maureen's after here is more a situation where maybe they've been in the C-suite as the CFO, as the CMO, and now have been elevated to be CEO. And there, the classic challenges are rebranding yourself, right? So really taking charge, but doing so in an integrated way, leading former peers, right? So really taking charge of the team. But you have to do that, in this case, Maureen, in the context of the virtual environment, right? And so it's much more challenging, I think, therefore, to do that rebranding, do that connecting, do that step up and lead these folks piece for sure. But I'm guessing it's a whole lot easier than coming in from the outside as a CFO or a CEO right now. The term, this is from Cindy, the term observational learning at the beginning of this session really resonated with me. For what tips do you have to help new leaders with this, and how can buddies help here? So that was, we were talking about sort of the difficulty of the finely grained, nuanced learning that can go on when you're actually physically with people. Any thoughts about that one, Kelly?
Yeah, so that was the point I was going to make about how, listening skills is still relevant. Even though we have these great, video technology, we can see people live. I think active listening never goes out of style. And so that's something I would suggest that, and, obviously if you're a manager already, that's something that you've done well, right, in terms of leading your team and hearing people out and, trying to find the right time and the right place to talk to your folks. And so that's something I think that is going to be, you'll need that, right? Regardless of how technology change, how much crisis there is, we all have to be good listener, but maybe even more so now I want to emphasize that we have fewer tools, right? Like I said about those impromptu meetings. So hearing people out and setting aside the time where you both are in the right mindset to have those harder, difficult conversations.
No, I think that's such a great point. I think also, observational learning in the team context obviously is a whole lot more difficult, right? Because you're just seeing pictures and you can't really see. And what you don't see, by the way, is people chatting and sending messages backwards and forwards in the midst of the meeting, right? Too, which we know goes on in the virtual environment. I think to me, that means you need to spend more time one-on-one with people, right? Because you can still do that kind of exactly active listening, Kelly, connecting work that, across video, but it's easier if you're kind of doing it just one-on-one in the end. So good. So we reached the top of the hour. I think we're going to close things up at this point. I hope, folks, that you found this helpful. As we mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending out a recording of the video, which will also include the slides, of course. And best wishes, and join us for the next Power Onboarding webinar.
Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly and Michael, for an informative session. And if you are interested in finding out how Genesys can help your organization, please complete the inquiry form on any page on our website, which is www.genesisadvisors.com. And one of our experts will contact you to discuss your needs without obligation. On behalf of Genesys, I would like to thank you for joining us today.